Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to be demoing how I painted this pink mountain landscape using soft pastels. I am working in a pastel matte sketchbook that I made, but I decided to test out my pastel grounds in it. So I grabbed a palette knife, an old paintbrush, some Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay Indie ink in the color Violet, an old paint palette, and then my pastel ground. And I'm pretty new to pastel ground. I had just gotten it and I wanted to test it out. And then here are the colors that I decided to use for this painting. I didn't use all of them, but I just went through a few sets of pastels I had and grabbed some that I thought would work. So I took my palette and I mixed some of the pastel ground with some of the ink, and I didn't grab quite enough pastel ground, so you can see me adding that in a second. This is a picture that I had started. It was going to be a picture of a bunch of crocuses with kind of a blurry background, but I realized it just wasn't working for the size of this picture. My sketchbook is pretty small, and trying to do that many flowers and those kinds of techniques wasn't working. And so I ended up doing a crocus on a different page of my book, and I just kind of focused on one, which you guys can watch here. So I painted the pastel ground out on my paper, and then I put a few things in the corner to weigh it down so it wouldn't like warp or bend. Pastel matte paper is thick, it's like on a thick cardstock, but I didn't want to risk it warping. Then I let it dry completely, and then I grabbed my pastels and started working. I took a white pastel pencil and kind of just sketched in the shapes of the mountains, and then I started working on the sky. And doing this, you can really see the texture of the pastel ground. The pastel ground has a pretty fine texture. It will give your surface the texture of sanded paper, but it will also take on whatever texture you apply it with. So since I used a paintbrush to apply it, you can see all those paintbrush strokes. And this is a pro or a con depending on what you want to achieve with your picture. I thought it was really fun to kind of change up the type of texture I'm working on, and I liked kind of those vertical strokes I saw. Since this, I have tried different techniques with applying pastel matte or pastel ground to surfaces, which I'll talk about in a future video. But I just layered up some blues, some like very pale gray blue colors, and a pale yellow color. It's more like an off-white into the sky, and then I just blended it out. I didn't want too much of the violet poking through in the sky, so I mostly blended that. With your pastel ground, you can do acrylic paints if you want it to be more opaque. So you want to change the color completely. You don't want anything showing through. Tone your paper a specific color. You can do your acrylic paints with it and make it a very specific color. The pastel ground on its own is transparent, so you could do an underpainting and then put the pastel grounds over the top and work like that. I like the inks because it just toned the paper and kind of camouflaged the underpainting that I had done, and then allowed me to work over the top of it. But I didn't feel like I needed to do acrylic paints because I was going to be working so opaquely with my pastels. So once I finished this guy, I started working on my mountains. I just worked on kind of blocking in the basic shapes of colors I saw. So I saw some pinks and blues and violets and some subtle oranges in the mountains. And so I just was kind of blocking in the basic shapes. And then I'm going to blend it out using my soft tool. So the soft tool is just like a plastic palette knife with a sponge that fits over the end, kind of like a sock. And you can wash them out later and let them dry and then reuse them. And I just use it to kind of blend in this base layer of pastels. When you're working small with soft pastels, you're not doing detail on the same level that you would if you were using pastel pencils or like a really fine paintbrush. So I love pastels because you end up being a little bit more impressionistic. It forces me to loosen up because I can't get the same kind of detail I would if I was working with a pastel pencil. Just because these pastels are so much bigger and my surface is so small that I really just have to look at shapes and just kind of imply what is there, not trying to make things exact. But for my pink of my mountains in the distance, I used a lot of pale, almost bluey pinks, and then I added a little bit of warmth with some salmons, and then I had some pale blues and violets for those mountains because I really wanted them to kind of recede visually. I didn't want them to be too concentrated colors or too vibrant, and I wanted them to be just slightly more muted. Then I worked some more on the mountains, and then I started blocking in some of the midground, so that little field or pasture that you see. So fun fact, this reference photo is actually one I took. Usually I grab some from Pixabay and stuff for the ones I'm teaching, but this is a picture I took from Pixabay when I was hiking this end of summer, early fall, and I live next to the mountains, and I went up further into the mountains to kind of see the early signs of autumn coming. And it was around sunset, and you could see the sunset being reflected off the mountains. And growing up near the mountains, that was actually one of my favorite ways to enjoy the sunset. It wasn't always just watching the sunset. I loved seeing how the sunset would make the mountains glow around and what colors would be reflected off of them. And so I snapped this picture because it was something I missed when I lived out of state, not near my hometown mountains. So I blocked in this kind of midground of the field, and I kept my markings very horizontal, going from left to right, so that it read a little bit more flat, like a field or something like that. I did a few little marks to indicate maybe some trees in the distance or some bushes and things like that. And then I'm starting to work on the foreground, and the color saturation is going to be a little bit stronger here in this foreground. And you can see in the reference photo, there's some trees up close, there's some bushes. You can see the little colors changing. So there's reds, oranges, yellows mixed in with the greens. And so then I'm going to focus on that. So I'm starting to block in this tree, and I'm layering up my greens and dark blues and then the lighter greens as well to start to indicate where these trees are. And to get these like thinner branches and leaf textures, I rolled my pastel on the side to get some of those markings. And if you want to learn more about creating different kinds of textures using soft pastels, I have a video where I go fully in depth on that right here if you want to watch that. Now I'm just working some more on some of these bushes. One thing I wish I would have grabbed when I was kind of grabbing colors is I wish I would have grabbed some more kind of gray downed green colors. The greens I grabbed were very either vibrant or very dark. So what I did to kind of compensate for that without having to pull out more colors was I mixed it with this blue gray color I had. And by mixing that, it helped to mute some of that color down so it wasn't quite so vibrant. So if you don't grab the exact color, try seeing if you can layer up the colors you already have to help tweak and adjust what you have so they work better. Now I'm starting to block in the red tree. I'm not trying to get every detail in here. Again, this is a very small picture and there's no way I can get every little tiny detail in, but I am looking at the general shapes. So the general shape of this red tree is kind of like a teardrop shape. So I'm trying to make my marks that indicate leaves kind of follow that general shape. I am making sure there's some darker tones to help indicate the shadows that are inside the tree, some highlights where it's a little bit more yellow, where the sun might be hitting it, and giving a little bit of dimension. The blending tool I'm using here is a rubber shaper or a clay shaper. It has like a silicone end on it, and I really like this for kind of softening edges, especially details like this, because it doesn't overblend. When you use something like a soft tool or a sponge, it really like softens out what you're blending a ton and lifts up a lot of pigment, where the silicone end kind of just pushes it in and kind of smears it just a little bit. So each blending tool has its own techniques that you use it for. As I'm working, you can really see the texture of the pastel ground and the paintbrush that I did in those early layers. If you have been around this channel, you know that I've worked in the sketchbook quite a bit over the last few years. And usually it has a very velvety, consistent texture. And it's great for details because it's so smooth and so even. That's what I love about UArt paper, and I love about pastel matte paper is it's very consistent on the texture. But it was really fun having kind of this vertical line and texture within this picture. And I think it helped to create and imply some of the texture in these trees and bushes in the foreground, especially since it was a little bit darker. Those little dark spots kind of showing through from the paper helped to give a little bit more depth. So don't be afraid to kind of play with texture, different textures of paper, or like if you're working with sanded paper, what grit you choose can really affect your end results. A very fine grit, like an 800 pastel paper, is really, really great for details, but something that's a little bit more coarse can be really helpful in something like a landscape where you're trying to generate textures and things like that. So just keep in mind that the type of paper you choose and the texture it has can really affect the end result of your picture. So I'm just adding a little bit more bushes and trees in the distance and kind of changing up some of the markings around there. You'll notice in the foreground that I changed my strokes of how I applied the pastels to make them match different kinds of bushes and plants, so it wasn't too much the same. I took a dark blue pastel and I added some of that to the shadow areas on the mountains, and then I blended it, and then I'm just doing a light layer of purple over the top. I just did that to help darken up the values because I didn't have a really dark muted purple with me, and so I just layered my pastels to help darken up the value and blended it on the paper. With pastels, you typically grab more colors than what you would use with watercolor. You can do a whole watercolor paper or picture with just a handful of colors, like maybe 3 or 4 colors all together, and then you mix it on your palette. With pastels, you tend to grab a lot because you can't mix the colors the same way as you would with your watercolor, and it's a lot more work. But you can still blend and adjust and tweak your colors by blending them on the paper and layering them on top of each other. So now I'm just kind of in the stage of refining details. I had blocked everything in, and I'm just tweaking and adjusting as I go along to get the details the way I want them to look. One of the things I love about landscapes is I don't have to be quite as precise as if I'm doing a portrait. If you get a little detail wrong on a portrait, it can make the whole face look wrong. It can make it not look like the person you're trying to draw, all that kind of stuff. And so Those are so much more precise and stressful when I'm working on them. Landscapes, I can just use it as a basic guide and then let my creativity have fun. I don't have to stick with what the picture shows. So in this case, I added some more pinks and reds to the foreground. I did kind of a reddish color on the right side that it isn't in the reference photo. It's more orange. But I wanted to pull some of that red that you see in that big tree in a couple other areas of the picture, just so it wasn't the main focus. I wanted most of the focus to be on these pink mountains, and then just have the red in the bush kind of accentuate that. And so by adding red into a few other areas of the picture, it stopped being the main focus. One of my favorite things that I love about pastel work, and is what kind of drew me into it, is how impressionistic you can be. It really forces me to loosen up. So I know I've done some really realistic artwork using pastels, especially pastel pencils. But when I pull out my soft pastels, I have to let go. And ever since I was little, I've loved impressionistic artwork, like Monet, even John Singer Sargent to some degree. It doesn't have to be like full-on impressionistic or pointillism, but I love being able to see brush strokes and texture on the picture up close, and then taking steps back and then seeing how all of those little strokes and markings and layers of color go together to make a full piece. And I can really get that with pastels. And working small like this, and I mentioned it earlier, and then using the soft pastels instead of focusing as much on my pastel pencils, it really forced me to be a little bit more impressionistic and kind of take a step back, which I really enjoyed doing. And it was a really good exercise for me as someone that gets a little too tight and a little less painterly. So I'm just been layering up the colors. I added some of the red tones to the mountains to help warm them up just a smidge. I don't want them to come forward too much. I don't want them to compete with our bright red trees in the foreground, but I wanted them to feel a little bit warmer. So I'm just layering up the colors I have and doing my final details. And you can really see those vertical stripes here, which I just love. I know I've mentioned that several times, but I just really loved it about this picture. I keep actually coming back and looking at this picture several days later in my sketchbook because I just really enjoyed myself and was just kind of in the painting groove. So I'm adding some of this pale blue just to help cool it down, help those mountain shadows kind of fall back visually. And I'm using it to help dull up some of the blues in the foreground so that they're not all vibrant greens. Now I'm just adding some highlights and some last details to this foreground, adding some mustard tones. And again, you can see how I'm kind of changing up the different kinds of markings I'm doing and how I'm applying it. So a lot of times in painting, you're using different kinds of paint brushes to create different textures and patterns. With pastels, you just kind of change up how you hold the pastel in your hand and how you manipulate it, and that will change how the pastel's applied. So it's almost like your hand and the pastel become your paintbrush. And that's something else I love about pastels. They're so tactile. Okay guys, so the picture is pretty much done. I hope you found this helpful at all, and let me know if you've ever tried pastel grounds or not, and if you like them. This was my first time really using them. And if you have any questions or comments about art in general, please leave them down below and I will do my best to answer and respond. And if you want to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. Also, one more also, if you guys are following any of my tutorials or following along in my live streams, please take a picture of that and tag me in it over on Instagram or on Facebook. Links in my description box below. But I love seeing what you guys create, and it really excites me when I see others kind of following along and learning from my videos. It really means a lot. Anyways, I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time. Bye!